Flash floods have hit parts of Saudi Arabia as heavy rainfall has been recorded across the kingdom since last week.
Scientists are speechless. Beneath the sand of one of the most barren deserts on Earth, Saudi Arabia has been secretly building something so massive, so unbelievable, that it has left the entire world stunned. Nobody saw this coming. Nobody thought it was even possible. And yet, here we are. What they found hidden underground has completely rewritten everything we thought we knew about this country.
We will reforest the landscape with the water that we captured from the flash flood.
The United States is shocked. Experts are baffled. And once you see what Saudi Arabia has actually pulled off, you will never look at this nation the same way again. Saudi Arabia is one of the driest places on Earth. There are no natural rivers running through it, no lakes to draw from, and rainfall is so rare that many parts of the country go months, sometimes longer, without seeing a single drop. For a nation of over 35 million people, that creates an enormous problem. Water is not optional. It is the foundation of everything from drinking and cooking to farming and industry. So how exactly does a country with almost no natural fresh water manage to keep its cities running, its population fed, and its economy growing? The answer is a combination of engineering, geology, and some very difficult choices that are still playing out today. To understand the situation, it helps to start with the basics of what Saudi Arabia actually has to work with. The country sits mostly on the Arabian Peninsula, a vast stretch of desert and semi-arid land where temperatures regularly climb above 45 degrees Celsius in the summer months. Rainfall, where it does occur, averages around 100 millimeters per year across many regions. That is a fraction of what most countries receive. In some areas, the figure is even lower. Rain does not fall steadily or predictably. It tends to arrive in short, intense bursts, often seasonal, and then disappear entirely for long stretches of time. Given those conditions, Saudi Arabia has invested heavily in infrastructure designed to capture whatever water does fall from the sky. Since 2021, the country has constructed 522 dams. That number is striking for a place that many people assume has no meaningful rainfall at all, but the logic behind it makes sense once you understand how the terrain works. When rain does fall in Saudi Arabia, it flows into what are called wadis. These are dry riverbeds, channels carved into the landscape over thousands of years, which remain empty most of the time but fill rapidly when storms pass through. Without dams to intercept that water, it would either rush across the surface and evaporate quickly in the heat, or soak into the ground before it could be put to any practical use. The dams serve as a way to hold that water in place long enough for it to be treated and distributed. The total storage capacity across the country's dam network is estimated at around 650 billion gallons. One of the more significant examples is the Hale Dam, located roughly 14 kilometers east of Khaybar in the Medina region. Built between 2003 and 2009, it ranks as the second largest dam in the country, with a reservoir capacity of approximately 250 million cubic meters. It supports flood control, irrigation, and local water supply, while also helping to recharge the groundwater below. In the Mecca region alone, there are around 60 dams with a combined capacity of 232 billion gallons. These figures give a sense of the scale of effort that has gone into capturing surface water in a country where surface water is extremely limited. But dams and rainfall collection only go so far. The volumes involved, while impressive on paper, are not enough on their own to meet the demands of a modern, growing nation. That brings us to what has historically been Saudi Arabia's most significant water source: groundwater. Beneath the surface of Saudi Arabia lies a vast amount of water that has nothing to do with recent rainfall. Geological surveys estimate that there are approximately 26 trillion gallons of water sitting underground across the country. That sounds like an almost unimaginable quantity, and in raw terms it is. However, the picture becomes more complicated when you look at what kind of water it actually is. Only a small portion of that underground supply is what scientists call renewable groundwater. This is water that is naturally replenished over time through rainfall, filtering down through the soil and rock. The renewable portion is estimated at around 739 billion gallons per year. That sounds like a lot, but when set against the country's total consumption, it falls far short of what is needed. The rest of Saudi Arabia's groundwater falls into a very different category. Scientists refer to it as fossil water, and the name gives a fairly clear indication of what it involves. This is water that has been trapped underground for thousands, and in some cases, millions of years. It accumulated during a period in Earth's history when the Arabian Peninsula had a very different climate. Thousands of years ago, the region received far more rainfall than it does today. Rivers flowed across areas that are now open desert. Over time, that water seeped deep into the ground and collected in what are known as aquifers, large underground formations of rock and sediment that can hold enormous volumes of water. The critical difference between fossil water and renewable groundwater is straightforward. Renewable groundwater gets replenished. Fossil water does not, at least not on any timescale that is useful to human civilization. Once it is pumped out of the ground, it is gone. There is no mechanism in place to put it back, not in any meaningful time frame. The rainfall that Saudi Arabia receives today is nowhere near sufficient to recharge those ancient aquifers. This creates a situation that is often described using a financial analogy, spending from a savings account with no income coming in. For a time, the balance looks fine, but if withdrawals continue at the same rate, eventually there is nothing left. Saudi Arabia has been drawing heavily on its fossil water reserves for decades. The water is extracted using pumps and then channeled to cities, agricultural land, and homes across the country. It has been essential to feeding the population and sustaining urban growth. Without it, many of the developments that have transformed Saudi Arabia over the past several decades simply would not have been possible. However, the rate of extraction has consistently outpaced the rate of natural replenishment. Saudi Arabia consumes far more water than it can replace through rainfall alone. The demand comes from multiple directions at once. Drinking water and household use account for a significant share, but agriculture is also a major factor, as is industry. Water is used for irrigation, for manufacturing processes, and for purposes that might be less obvious, such as maintaining parks and other green spaces in cities where having any greenery at all requires a considerable and sustained input of water. Adding to the pressure is the fact that Saudi Arabia's population has been growing steadily. More people means more demand across every category of water use. Projections suggest that this trend will continue, which means the gap between what the country can replenish naturally and what it actually needs is likely to widen rather than narrow. The unpredictability of rainfall makes the situation harder to plan around. Some years bring more rain than others, but there is no reliable pattern to count on. A slightly wetter year might ease pressure on the system temporarily, but it does not fundamentally change the underlying arithmetic. The renewable portion of groundwater is limited, the fossil water is finite, and the demand keeps growing. If extraction from underground reserves were to continue at unsustainable levels without any alternative supply being developed, the consequences would be severe. Underground water levels would drop, making extraction increasingly difficult and expensive. In some areas, the water could eventually run out altogether, leaving communities and industries without a reliable source. For a country in the middle of a desert, that is not an abstract concern. It is a very practical and immediate one. This reality is what has driven Saudi Arabia to look beyond its natural water resources entirely, and to pursue solutions that are less dependent on what the ground beneath it happens to hold. Faced with a water supply that could not keep pace with demand, Saudi Arabia had to find alternatives. Relying solely on groundwater was never going to be a long-term solution, and the country's engineers and planners knew it. The question was not whether to act, but how. With the Red Sea running along its western coast and the Persian Gulf bordering its eastern side, Saudi Arabia sits between two enormous bodies of water. The obvious problem is that both are salt water completely unusable for drinking, agriculture, or most industrial purposes without significant treatment first. But that geographical reality also pointed toward a potential solution, one that the country has pursued with remarkable scale and ambition over the past several decades. The first piece of the puzzle is desalination. This is the process of removing salt and other impurities from seawater to produce water that is clean enough for human use. In principle, the idea is straightforward. In practice, it is enormously complex, expensive, and energy-intensive. Despite those challenges, Saudi Arabia has become the world's leading producer of desalinated water, a position it has built through sustained investment in infrastructure along its coastlines. Back in the 1980s, the country's desalination capacity was relatively modest. The technology existed, but the scale was limited. Over the following decades, that changed significantly. By 2011, around 30 desalination plants were operating along the country's coastline. By 2023, that number had grown to 33, and by 2024, it had risen further to 43 facilities. Each expansion represents a deliberate response to growing demand and declining groundwater levels. The most prominent example of this infrastructure is the Ras Al Khaimah station, located on the eastern coast of Saudi Arabia. The station cost approximately $7.2 billion to construct and holds the Guinness World Record for being the largest desalination plant in the world. On a daily basis, it produces around 792 million gallons of fresh water. That is enough to supply millions of residents and support a wide range of industrial activity. It is a genuinely extraordinary piece of infrastructure, and it gives some indication of the level of commitment Saudi Arabia has made to solving its water problem through technology rather than waiting for nature to provide. The country also operates another major desalination facility in the city of Jubail, which consistently produces around 211 million gallons of fresh water every single day. When you look at the global picture, the concentration of large-scale desalination capacity in this region is striking. The next three largest desalination plants in the world after Ras Al Khaimah are located in the United Arab Emirates, which reflects the broader challenge facing Gulf states with limited fresh water and large growing populations. Countries like Israel and Australia have also made significant investments in desalination, but Saudi Arabia continues to lead in terms of overall output. Desalination is not without its drawbacks, and it would be misleading to present it as a clean or simple fix. The process requires very large amounts of energy. In Saudi Arabia, much of that energy comes from fossil fuels, which adds both to the cost and to the environmental footprint of producing the water. Compared to drawing water from a river or a well, desalination can cost anywhere from 3 to 10 times as much, depending on the method used and the location of the plant. That is a significant premium, and it makes desalinated water one of the more expensive ways a country can meet its water needs. There is also an environmental concern that comes with the process. When salt is removed from seawater, what remains is a concentrated brine, a liquid that is far saltier than the original seawater it came from. This brine has to go somewhere, and in most cases it is discharged back into the sea. If that discharge is not managed carefully, the concentrated salt content can harm marine ecosystems in the surrounding area. Fish, coral, and other sea life can struggle to survive in water that has had its salinity significantly altered. Saudi Arabia, like other nations operating large desalination plants, has to balance the need for fresh water against the potential damage to the coastal environment that its production creates. Despite these challenges, the desalination program has been essential to keeping Saudi Arabia functioning. But producing fresh water at a coastline is only part of the challenge. The country's major population centers, including Riyadh, which sits in the interior of the country, are hundreds of kilometers away from the sea. Getting the water from where it is produced to where it is needed requires a distribution system of its own, and that is where the second major piece of Saudi Arabia's water infrastructure comes in. The Saudi Water Authority, the government body responsible for managing the country's water resources, has overseen the construction of a vast underground pipeline network. This system is designed to move desalinated water from the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf across the country to inland cities, industrial zones, and residential areas. The scale of it is difficult to fully appreciate without some points of comparison. The pipelines, laid end-to-end, stretch approximately 8,700 miles. For context, the Nile River, which is the longest natural river on Earth, measures around 4,135 miles. Saudi Arabia's man-made water transport system is more than twice that length. The decision to run these pipelines underground rather than along the surface was a deliberate engineering choice driven by the realities of the desert environment. Temperatures in central Saudi Arabia regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius during the summer months. Any water left exposed to that level of heat, even in a pipe running above ground, would be at serious risk of evaporation, contamination, and temperature-related degradation. By burying the pipes underground, the system shields the water from the worst of the heat and from the effects of dust storms and other weather events that are common in the region. It also helps maintain consistent pressure and flow across long distances, which is important for ensuring that water reaches its destination at a usable rate. This newer underground system is distinct from an older existing water network that also runs across the country. As of 2019, the Total length of the national water supply network was estimated at around 78,200 miles. However, much of that older network consists of surface-level or shallowly buried pipelines. Those earlier pipes are more exposed to heat, weather damage, and the physical stresses of the desert environment. The newer underground system, by contrast, is deeper, better insulated, and more resilient. It functions almost like an invisible river, carrying treated water silently beneath the sand from the coast to the interior. The engineering required to build this system was considerable. The pipelines do not run across flat, open desert the entire way. Parts of the route pass through the Hejaz mountain range, which runs along Saudi Arabia's western edge. To get the pipes through that terrain, construction teams use tunnel boring machines and in some places controlled explosions to break through dense rock formations, including granite and limestone. Some of the pipes themselves are over 2 meters wide, and each section had to be laid with precision to maintain the pressure levels needed to move water over such large distances without losing flow or risking structural failure. Working conditions during construction were extremely demanding. Summer temperatures made daytime work dangerous for extended periods, and teams often had to operate during the early morning hours or overnight to avoid the worst of the heat. Beyond the temperature, the landscape itself presented difficulties. Shifting sand dunes, unpredictable dust storms, and the occasional flash flood all added complexity to what was already a logistically challenging project. Stabilizing the ground sufficiently to dig deep trenches and then lay heavy pipelines required careful planning and ongoing management throughout the construction process. The result of all this effort is a system that Saudi Arabia did not have access to through any natural means. Nature did not provide the country with rivers, so the country built its own. The underground pipeline network connects the desalination plants on the coast with the cities and communities that need the water most urgently, providing a supply line that is more reliable and more protected than anything that existed before. Together, the desalination plants and the underground pipeline system represent a serious attempt to address a water crisis that has been building for a long time. They are not perfect solutions. Desalination remains expensive and energy-heavy. The pipelines require ongoing maintenance and are costly to expand. But they have given Saudi Arabia something it previously lacked: a water supply that is not entirely dependent on what the ground beneath it happens to hold, and that does not diminish every time a pump is switched on. Solving the water problem was never going to be enough on its own. Even with desalination plants running at full capacity and an underground pipeline network delivering water across the country, Saudi Arabia still faces a deeper challenge that water infrastructure alone cannot address. The land itself is degrading, the desert is expanding, soil that was once capable of supporting vegetation is being lost. Temperatures are climbing, air quality in urban areas is suffering. These are not separate issues from the water crisis. They are connected to it, and they require a response that goes beyond pipes and pumps. That response has taken the form of what Saudi Arabia calls its Greening Initiative, one of the most ambitious environmental programs currently underway anywhere in the world. The scale of what is being proposed is genuinely difficult to take in at first. The plan involves planting 10 billion trees across the country over the coming years, and protecting approximately 30% of Saudi Arabia's land. The area targeted for greening covers around 184 million acres. To put that in some kind of context, that is an enormous stretch of territory in a country that is already one of the largest in the world by land area, and much of it is currently desert or near desert. The driving concern behind the initiative is desertification, which is the process by which land that was previously productive gradually turns into desert. This is not a problem unique to Saudi Arabia, but it is one that the country faces with particular urgency given its geography and climate. As the desert expands, it does not simply take over empty space. It threatens agricultural land, disrupts ecosystems, and pushes communities off land that was previously livable. The sandstorms and dust events that regularly sweep through the region are partly a consequence of this process. When there is no vegetation to hold soil in place, the wind picks it up and carries it, sometimes for hundreds of kilometers. Planting trees on a large scale is one of the most effective tools available for slowing and reversing desertification. Trees and other vegetation anchor the soil, reducing the amount that wind can strip away. Their root systems help retain moisture in the ground, which in turn makes the surrounding soil more hospitable to further plant growth. Over time, a landscape that has been regenerated becomes increasingly self-sustaining. The vegetation traps more moisture, which supports more vegetation, which traps more moisture. It is a gradual process, but the direction of change is the opposite of what happens when land is left to degrade. The greening initiative is framed around several goals that go beyond simply planting trees and walking away. Food security is one of them. Saudi Arabia currently imports a very significant proportion of the food it consumes, partly because its land is not productive enough to support large-scale domestic agriculture. If the greening program succeeds in making substantial areas of land more fertile, it could reduce that dependency over time. More productive soil means more options for growing crops locally, which matters both economically and from a national security perspective. A country that can feed more of its own population from its own land is less vulnerable to disruptions in global food supply chains. Air quality is another area where the initiative is expected to make a measurable difference. In cities like Riyadh, the air can be seriously affected by heat, dust, and airborne particles. The concentration of concrete and asphalt in urban environments creates what is commonly known as a heat island effect, where temperatures in the city are noticeably higher than in the surrounding area, because hard surfaces absorb and retain heat rather than reflecting it. Trees and green spaces help to counteract this by providing shade, releasing moisture into the air through a process called transpiration, and absorbing some of the radiant heat that would otherwise be trapped at street level. Studies have suggested that widespread tree planting can reduce concentrations of fine airborne particles, specifically those known as PM2.5 and PM10, by up to 20% depending on local conditions. These particles are associated with a range of respiratory illnesses and other health problems, so reducing their concentration in urban air has direct benefits for public health. Fewer particles in the air means fewer people developing breathing difficulties, fewer hospital visits, and a generally healthier urban population. The temperature reduction that comes with increased vegetation cover is also significant, even if the numbers involved sound modest in isolation. Estimates suggest that widespread greening could lower temperatures by around 2 degrees Celsius in affected areas. In a country where summer street temperatures regularly hit 50 degrees Celsius, a reduction of even a few degrees has a real impact on the daily lives of people living and working in those conditions. It affects how much time people can safely spend outdoors, how much energy is needed to cool buildings, and how sustainable outdoor physical work is during the hottest months of the year. The program is not being implemented as a single national project rolled out uniformly across the entire country. It is operating at multiple levels simultaneously. At the national level, there are targets and funding commitments tied to the overall goal of 10 billion trees. At the regional level, individual cities and areas are developing their own greening plans that fit within the broader national framework. Cities like Riyadh are incorporating green infrastructure into their urban planning in ways that go beyond simply planting trees along streets. There are parks, green corridors, and landscape public spaces being designed as permanent features of the urban environment, rather than afterthoughts added once the buildings are already in place. NEOM, the large-scale development project being built in the northwest of the country, is also being designed with environmental considerations built in from the start. Whether or not NEOM ultimately delivers on all of its stated ambitions, its stated design principles reflect a broader shift in how Saudi Arabia is thinking about the relationship between urban development and the natural environment. The idea that a city or a region can be built with sustainability as a core requirement, rather than an optional extra, represents a genuine change in approach. As of 2024, hundreds of millions of trees had already been planted as part of the initiative, with the pace of planting increasing year on year. The full target of 10 billion trees is understood to be a long-term goal, one that will take many years, possibly decades, to fully achieve. The ecological reality is that planting a tree is only the beginning. Young trees need water, care, and time before they can provide the full range of benefits that mature vegetation offers. In a desert environment, establishing trees that can survive and thrive without constant intervention is a significant horticultural and logistical challenge. The wrong species planted in the wrong location will simply die, which is why the selection of tree species suited to the local climate is a critical part of the planning process. There are also broader questions about how the greening initiative interacts with Saudi Arabia's water infrastructure. trees need water, and in a country where water is already scarce, large-scale planting programs have to be designed with that constraint in mind. The water used to maintain new vegetation cannot simply be drawn from the same reserves that are already under pressure. This means that the greening initiative is, in a very practical sense, dependent on the success of the desalination and pipeline programs described earlier. Fresh water produced at the coast and moved inland through the underground network will likely play a role in keeping newly planted areas alive, particularly in the early years before the vegetation is established enough to be more self-sustaining. Seen in that light, the three pillars of Saudi Arabia's approach to its environmental challenges, water capture and storage, desalination and distribution, and land restoration through greening, are not independent strategies. They are interconnected, and the success of each depends to some degree on the others working as intended. Water infrastructure makes the greening possible. Greening, in return, helps to improve soil quality, reduce temperatures, and stabilize the land in ways that benefit the broader environment. What Saudi Arabia is attempting is, by any measure, an extraordinary undertaking. A country that was defined for most of its modern history by scarcity, by the absence of rivers, by the relentless advance of the desert, is now actively working to change that reality. Whether the full ambition of the greening initiative can be achieved within the timeline set out remains to be seen. Environmental programs of this scale involve enormous complexity, and the gap between stated goals and actual outcomes is not always small. But the direction is clear, and the resources being committed to it are substantial. For a country that not long ago had no natural freshwater sources, no rivers, and no obvious path to environmental sustainability, the scale of what is now being attempted represents a significant shift. The desert is not going away, and the underlying challenges of heat, aridity, and population growth are not going away either. But the response to those challenges is no longer simply to extract more from the ground and hope for the best. It is to build, plant, and invest in systems that can sustain the country's future in ways that its natural environment, on its own, never could.